Imagine being fully awake while your own body decays, piece by piece. Most people struck by gangrene slip into unconsciousness or die from shock before the rot consumes them. But in the late summer of 1715, one man endured the impossible. For 3 agonizing weeks, he lay alert as his legs blackened, softened, and peeled away. He could smell himself dying. This wasn't a soldier wounded in battle or a victim of plague. It was the most powerful ruler in Europe, Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. For 72 years he had ruled, raised palaces, and led armies that redrew Europe's map. He believed his crown came from God himself. But that belief meant nothing when, after a hunt, a dark blemish appeared on his leg. Louis's surgeons recognized the peril. Amputation was the only hope. Yet they dithered, debating gout and sciatica while their sovereign's flesh wasted away. By the time they admitted the truth, decay had reached the bone. One finally told him, "Sire, we can remove your legs, but we cannot save your life." What unfolded in his chamber at Versailles from August 10th to September 1st, 1715, horrified everyone who witnessed it. Even the man who prepared royal bodies for burial recoiled. The Sun King didn't simply pass. He remained painfully aware as necrosis advanced day after day. But before those dreadful final hours, before surgeons pressed fingers into liquefied tissue and courtiers fled gagging from the stench, we must see how the greatest monarch in Europe ended up rotting alive. On the morning of August 10th, 1715, Louis XIV was still every inch the Sun King. At 76, he kept the strict schedule that had defined his reign. The Grand Lever at 8:30, a performance where favored nobles helped him dress, then chapel, then councils with ministers, later a public dinner, a ritual of control and display. That same morning he hunted at Marly, his beloved retreat from the rigid theater of Versailles. Hours on horseback passed easily. He had ridden those woods since childhood. No one noticed anything unusual until the ride home, when he felt a sudden jab above his knee. Minor, yet enough to make him shift in the saddle. By the time the carriage entered Versailles that evening, he was limping. His chief physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, whose poor judgment would soon prove fatal, glanced at the leg and called it sciatica. "Rest and picnics," he said, "and His Majesty would soon dance again." Louis refused rest. To reveal weakness was unthinkable. France, Europe, the entire court revolved around his image of strength. On August 11th, he rose as always, attended Mass through stabbing pain, and presided over council with a marble-still face. Observers saw the strain. Fingers gripping the chair's arm until knuckles whitened, perspiration beading his brow despite the cool evening. Madame de Maintenon, his secret wife, noticed he barely touched supper, extraordinary for a man famous for devouring banquets. By August 13th, the pain burned as though fire licked his flesh from inside. Fagan offered laudanum, opium laced with wine, which dulled little. That morning, the valet spotted a coin-sized black spot on the king's leg. Fagan dismissed it as a bruise from pressure, advising more compression. In truth, that mark signaled tissue death. Senile gangrene, where blood flow to the limbs fails and the flesh dies while the victim still feels everything. Common in elderly diabetics, and Louis, after decades of feasting on meat and sweets, almost certainly suffered from diabetes. It was a mystery to 18th century doctors who still clung to theories of humors. By August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, Louis XIV made his last public appearance. Carried nearly to the chapel, he stood through Mass, his face ashen, lips tinged blue. An odor already hung about him. The heavy sweetness of rotting flesh, unmistakable to anyone who has worked around death. Perfumed cloths discreetly pressed to noses could not hide the smell. That night, swelling doubled his leg's size. The black stain spread upward like spilled ink. Skin stretched tight, fissured, oozing foul fluid. Fagan finally summoned colleagues, not to admit error, but to share the blame. On August 17th, four eminent physicians arrived. They inspected the mottled, bloated limb, spoke in guarded Latin, mortificatio, putrefactio, and proposed a cure. Baths of donkey's milk, dressings soaked in camphor, and bleeding the patient. They drained a man of 76 whose leg was disintegrating. Louis fainted 3 times. When he revived, He asked plainly, "Am I dying?" They lied. His constitution was strong, they said. With rest, he would recover. Meanwhile, Versailles stirred with intrigue. Not solemn watchfulness, but maneuvering. Philippe d'Orléans, the king's nephew, dispatched riders to Paris. The Duke of Maine, legitimized son of Louis, rallied allies. Around the monarch's bed, the struggle for succession began while he still signed decrees through gritted teeth. August 25th broke him. It was St. Louis's day, honoring his ancestor, the Crusader King. Determined to prove vitality, he ordered himself dressed. When attendants tried sliding stockings over his ravaged legs, he screamed, his first cry of pain before the court. The silk clung with pieces of dead skin. The stench was like graveyards flung open. Carried back to bed, Louis never rose again. What followed over the next week beggars belief. Gangrene consumed his entire left leg, foot to thigh. The flesh turned black, streaked green, soft as cheese. Surgeons reported their fingers sank easily through the tissue. The smell forced servants to burn incense and perfumes, producing a nauseating blend of sweetness and decay. Through it all, Louis's mind stayed sharp, dreadfully sharp. He managed affairs of state from the pillows, pen trembling. On August 26th, he summoned his great-grandson, the 5-year-old Duke of Anjou, future Louis XV. Picture the scene. A tiny boy in silks entering a chamber heavy with corruption, approaching a grandfather whose body was falling apart. The king gathered the child close, the reek unavoidable, and murmured words meant to outlive the rot. "My child, you are about to become a great king. Do not follow me in my love of war. Do not repeat my mistakes in draining your people's strength and wealth. Try to ease their burdens, for I did not. I loved war too much, and I spent far beyond reason. Do not copy me in these things. That farewell, recorded in court memoirs, should stop us cold. Think about it carefully." This was Louis XIV, the man who had fought for 54 of his 72 years on the throne, the ruler who raised Versailles at a cost equal to billions today, the monarch who fashioned himself as a god on earth, confessing to a child that he had failed. He knew what he had done to France. He knew the treasury was empty, the countryside worn down, the nation bled dry, and he was pleading with a 5-year-old not to repeat his sins. The boy left the chamber in tears. He never saw his great-grandfather again. On August 27th, the physicians uncovered something terrible. The gangrene had eaten into the bone. Louis looked at his rotting leg and, with grim humor, remarked, "Gentlemen, I seem to be coming apart sooner than expected." At last one surgeon, named Marechal, spoke the truth. Taking the king's hand, he said, "Sire, we could amputate, but it would gain you only days, perhaps hours. The corruption is too far spread. You must prepare yourself." Louis declined the knife. "If I must die," he said, "let me keep my limbs." He had known all along, of course. He could see his own flesh falling away, could smell his own decay. But hearing it openly gave him a strange sense of calm. He turned to his confessor and said, "I have lived as a king. At least allow me to die as a Christian." August 28th and 29th became days of farewell. The king summoned his courtiers in small groups, thanked them, and begged their forgiveness. Many wept openly, not only for their sovereign but for the end of the only era they had ever known. Some had been born in Versailles and lived every hour in his shadow. What would happen when the sun finally set? To his illegitimate children, he gave blessings, tears in his eyes, aware that once he was gone, they would be stripped of title and dignity. To Madame de Maintenon, the secret wife who had stood by him in silence, he whispered, "I thought dying would be harder." She stayed with him as his fever climbed so high that physicians marveled he remained conscious at all. Outside his chamber, the vultures gathered more boldly. Philippe d'Orléans was already acting as regent, giving orders, bargaining positions. The Duke of Maine scrambled to build support. Letters sped between Versailles, Paris, Madrid, and Rome, each one asking the same question. How much longer? On August 30th, a curious figure named Brun, a self-proclaimed healer from Marly, somehow slipped into the king's chamber. He carried a red elixir he claimed would cure gangrene. The official physicians protested, but Louis, whether desperate or merely intrigued, allowed it. Brun gave him drops of the potion. To everyone's shock, the fever fell. He asked for food for the first time in days. Courtiers outside began to whisper of a miracle. Succession plans paused. Some even said Philippe turned pale at the news. But hope died within hours. The fever returned stronger than ever, and with it the pain. Necrosis had numbed his nerves, but now sensation came back like fire burning through his leg. That night, from August 30th to 31st, Louis screamed in torment, crying out to God for release. His final clear day was August 31st. The gangrene advanced still further. He confessed to his Jesuit confessor, Père Letellier. Cardinal de Rohan gave him the last rites. And then he did something extraordinary. He ordered his bed curtains drawn wide so all might see. "Look well," he said. "This is what becomes of the glory of kings." He wanted the court, his family, and history itself to stare at the truth. The Sun King was now a ruin of flesh, a reminder that power and splendor end in rot. As midnight approached, his breath became shallow, rattling. He murmured fragments of psalms, prayers in Latin. At one point he whispered, "I thought dying would be harder. Now I know it is not." On the morning of September 1st, 1715, at 8:15, the dawn glow touched the tall windows of Versailles. Madame de Maintenon held his hand. His confessor prayed at his side. His physicians stood useless. Louis XIV's chest rose, fell, then stilled. A mirror was held to his lips, no fog. A courtier turned to the packed nobles and declared, "The king is dead. Long live the king." Silence, a heartbeat long, broke into chaos. Philippe d'Orléans left at once to seize power. The Duke of Maine tried to follow but found guards blocking his way. The coup had already begun. Courtiers scattered like insects in sudden light, some rushing to pledge allegiance, others fleeing to estates to wait and watch. Louis XIV's corpse was left in the Mercury room, attended only by servants and the doctors who had failed him. The smell forced them to abandon the chamber within the hour. When the embalmers arrived, they balked. The legs had disintegrated so badly they came apart in their hands. What remained of the Sun King had to be poured into his coffin. From September 2nd to 10th it stood on display, before being taken to St. Denis. And here, tradition turned macabre. Royal custom required that the body be divided into 3 parts. The corpse to St. Denis, the heart to the Jesuits at St. Paul St. Louis, the entrails to Notre Dame. Some sources claimed the heart had already decayed into sludge, though reliable records are scarce. His funeral procession on September 9th was a shadow of what it should have been. Yes, there were torches, chanting, rituals, but witnesses noted jeers along the route. After 72 years, France had grown weary of the Sun King. The most telling moment came at the funeral oration. Bishop Massillon, gazing at the coffin, began not with praise, not with mourning, but with these words, "God alone is great." It was a direct rejection of everything Louis XIV had claimed for himself. All his magnificence, all his wars, his Versailles, his posture as a godlike ruler, reduced to a corpse that decayed so completely they could scarcely bury it. On September 2nd, Philippe d'Orléans annulled the king's will through the Parliament of Paris and claimed the regency for himself. Within days, the court abandoned Versailles. Power shifted back to Paris, as though the Sun King had never existed. And here's the chilling part. If even Louis XIV, the most absolute monarch in Europe, a man who ruled longer than any king in history, could end as a stinking carcass rotting in a coffin, then what does that say about us? About the fragility of power, of life, of glory? If you don't want the story, and the many others like it that reveal how the mighty truly fall, to vanish into the abyss, then stop what you're doing and subscribe right now. Because if you walk away without doing so, don't be surprised when you find yourself in the comments explaining why you refused, and others remind you that even the Sun King couldn't escape oblivion. The vast palace Louis had raised as a monument to his own glory stood hollow in the wake of his passing. A 700-room mausoleum for a dream gone to dust. The doctors who had attended him, especially Fagan, whose error in judging the creeping gangrene proved fatal, slipped away in disgrace. Fagin himself died in 1718, raving in delirium, muttering again and again about the black spot he should have noticed. Yet the most moving echo of that time came from the small boy who inherited the burden of the throne. Louis XV, just 5 years old, heir to an empty treasury and a nation spent from war. As a grown man, he recalled his last audience with the Sun King. The stench that turned his stomach, the sight of a body already surrendering to decay, and the whispered plea to avoid repeating the old man's mistakes. But he ignored it, ruling for nearly 60 years and leaving France poorer and more broken than before. The Bourbon crown limped on for 2 more reigns until the Revolution at last swept it away. When rebels pried open the royal tombs at St. Denis in 1793, they found Louis XIV's coffin of lead, melted it down for bullets, and tossed what remained of him into a common pit, smothered in quicklime. The monarch, once credited with declaring, "I am the state," ended as scattered shards of bone dissolved into chalky earth. The man who fancied himself a god perished rotting from the feet upward, fully aware, suffering until nearly his last breath, deserted by courtiers before his corpse had cooled. In those final days of August 1715, as gangrene devoured him, Louis XIV faced the one truth that none of his wealth, armies, or sacred titles could defy: the blunt, indifferent biology of death. Gold could not halt the bacteria festering in his flesh. Divine right could not stop the necrosis climbing his legs. No loyal regiment could drive back the infection eating him alive. His surgeon, Marichal, left a final, stark note. The king died exactly as a peasant would from the same disease, slowly, in agony, and with terrible clarity about what was happening to him. The real horror of his end was not only the pain but the shattering of an illusion that had bound France for 70 years. The Sun King was not immortal. He died over 22 days of worsening decay, each one peeling away another layer of the myth that cloaked him. Today, visitors to Versailles are shown splendor, the hall of mirrors, the sweeping gardens, the marble and gold, but not the mercury room where his body lay, nor the clouds of incense burned to disguise the reek of royal corruption. Guides rarely mention that his last words were not about honor or France but a weary confession. "Now I know what dying is." That is the grim lesson about absolute power. Men who believe themselves divine always arrive at the end, where Louis arrived in those terrible August hours, discovering that flesh rots the same whether clothed in silk or in rags, and that decay cares nothing for crowns. And as you sit here contemplating how even the greatest throne crumbles beneath the weight of mortality, don't wait to be reminded of your own fragility. Press that like button, subscribe right now so these lessons don't slip past you, and if you choose not to, at least step into the comments and explain why you would ignore the warning written in The Fall of Kings.